just before you
so
start?
very much.
Great. Got it.
Thank you. So now we're recording? Cool. Thank you so very much. And for this introduction as well, not just for inviting me. And I am very excited to be with you today. And I would like to start first by admitting not knowing how to fully analyze the current crisis in Israel. We're obviously amidst that, and as a scholar of political science, I'm doing my best to try and figure out what is it that we are witnessing from the outside, and as a citizen, an Israeli citizen, as a human being, trying to understand what is the right thing to do. And this is something that I've been struggling with for several months now, obviously, like many of my friends and peers. And what I would like to share with you today are mainly tentative reflections. And they are truly tentative, not just in the usual academic sense of work in progress. I'm trying to write about those issues, but it's unclear to me where we are heading. Okay, so I want to put that on the table, and more practically on the table, I'm not sure if the best way to go ahead is for me to have an ongoing talk and then Q&A. That's one option, right? The most conventional one. But if you find occasionally, I've prepared a talk and a presentation, but if you find occasionally moments in which you think there are issues worth raising questions about immediately, please do not hesitate. Okay? I'm just as comfortable having an ongoing conversation. I obviously don't know what is the level of your knowledge regarding the current crisis. So I will be presenting some insights, some findings, some connections, some of which will make sense, others may not. Feel completely free to interrupt at any moment. I don't know exactly how logistically, digitally you want to go ahead and do that, but I'm available to whatever sort of Q&A dynamics you would like to have. Okay? So I did prepare a presentation, as I mentioned. Let me share the screen and make sure that it works well. Okay, and now you see the full screen? Yeah, that's the full screen. Yeah, I guess that I somewhat tamed the original title, but we can still keep with that because it does engage the moral, the emotional dimension, and the possibility of suicide, a political suicide, politicized in some aspects, but self-inflicted. And first to entwine just briefly at the outset to where we are currently at, right? Passover, a celebration of emancipation, of liberation. But of course, it is not always easy to understand liberation from what. And if that is hard to grasp, it's sometimes even more hard to understand liberation for what. In Egypt, it was clear enough, liberation from slavery. But then liberation for what exactly? Wander the desert for decades? And what's the end of that? To create a people, equality, a kingdom of God on earth? Not entirely clear. And I imagine that for many people going through that experience in real time, if we are to embrace the biblical narrative, it wasn't that clear as they were at it. And what does liberty and liberation means in our days, in contemporary Israel? I think that it's right to just put that question out there as we will try to figure out some elements of it when we go along. And I thought of another way to try and probe the issue of liberation and of liberty towards something that I'm quite fond of, as the introduction suggested, which is existentialism. I don't know how many of you are familiar with existentialist philosophy, but those of you who are know probably about the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the keynote existentialists, the French philosopher. And what I find remarkable in this context of the nature of liberty is Sartre's first English essay, published just after the liberation of Paris. The title is Paris Alive, was published in the Atlantic. And I find the first sentence remarkable. Never were we freer than under the German occupation. It's almost unbelievable when you think about it, right? When you first read that sentence, you know, the immediate response is sort of, what the hell? Never were we freer than under the Nazi occupation. How could that be? And of course, Sartre readily accept that so many of their liberties were taken. So how come they were most free under Nazi occupation? Now, I wouldn't get into the subtleties of the article, but I think that Sartre managed to do something in his first English essay precisely because it was in English and not in French. Because in French, unlike in English and unlike in Hebrew, there is no distinction between liberty and freedom. There is no distinction. Liberté is used for both of those words. And of course, typically in English too, we would conflate the two. We will use liberty and freedom interchangeably. And I think that here we see a potential for distinguishing between the two aspects. Because liberty ultimately is about control. Sounds odd, I know, but if we take a deep breath and think about what liberty is really all about, and perhaps resort to the writings of the very famous philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who famously distinguished between positive and negative liberty, which are basically about who controls what. Positive liberty is about who controls, negative liberty is about controlling what. But what many people, I think, overlooked is the fact that whether positive or negative, liberty is about control. It is about who controls what. And that, to a large extent, is how we turn to our political life. In politics, we fight over who controls what. Freedom is different. Freedom is about choice, not about control. Freedom is about choice, about reasoning our choice, acting according to the choice, taking responsibility for our choices. This is freedom. It's not about control. Now, this boils down to the following. Control is always up to someone else, to a certain extent. This is why it is at the heart of politics. It's up for negotiations between us and others. Freedom is a matter of the self. The only person who can yield my own freedom is myself. If I live rather than freely, in bad faith, that is, I will teach myself to believe that there is no choice. I will teach myself to think in terms of I must instead of I choose. In terms of I cannot instead of I refuse. That's the distinction between liberty and freedom. And that is why, for Sartre, they were never as free as under the Nazi occupation, because the Nazi could have deprived them of all of their liberties. But not only did they not take away their freedom, their innate human freedom to make a choice, but made that choice even more momentous, because every moment under Nazi occupation meant that there was a choice to be made. Whether to yield, to cooperate, or to rebel. And all of this is a sort of a long philosophical introduction to basically saying, taking it to a certain edge, which I'm not reluctant to do. I think that there are times in humans' life that we should take things to the edge in order to discover truth. All of this is to say that this is the moment that Israel faces its own momentous choices. It's not obviously under Nazi occupation, but this is a moment of momentous choice, of fateful choice. And I thought about how to visually represent that choice. And I chose that way. Because there is nothing given about the Israeli flag. Nothing. It is a human creation. It's not a force of nature. And it symbolizes certain things. But symbols are up to people. And they can change. So I imagine that the flag you're all familiar with on the left. Anyone recognizes what we see on the right? Anyone who is willing to say? What do we see on the right? Again?
Kahanist.
Right. It's the symbol of the Kahana movement. Kah in Hebrew. I guess the best translation to English would be thus. This is the way that we are going to carry out our work. Work meaning establishing Jewish supremacy over the land of Israel, over the whole land of Israel. And that is the symbol of the Kahana at the center of it, right? It's still the Star of David. And the fist and its direction, I think, are telling of the sentiment behind it. Some of you are familiar with the sort of metaphor that I'm using in the title of this slide, either or by Kierkegaard. And here, of course, drew on the binding of Isaac as a main motive for his argument for a leap of faith. But this is, I think, a moment of either or for Israel. For some of us, it might not be as stark as I'm trying to present in this slide, but I think that in many ways, this may be what all of this amounts to. This is the either or moment. And it might be a long moment, it might be a couple of days or weeks, might be months or even several years. But I think that this is the moment to make the choice. Now, often enough, in humans' life, we escape freedom, we escape choice. And we might revisit that aspect later on. But it is important nonetheless, I think, to put the choice before us. Now, I've been in the past couple of months, and I've been teaching about the current crisis, democracy in general. I've been more of an activist than any other time during my life, at least. So we've created also courses dedicated to the current crisis. And the way that I started the course here in Israel, at Tel Aviv University, I'm from Jerusalem. I'm Jerusalemite. I'm talking to you from Jerusalem. I was born here, raised here, but I am teaching at Tel Aviv University. And I started my class in asking the students, what is democracy to them? And we obviously received many answers. It was fascinating to follow those. And what I tried to answer in the wake of those students' answers was the following: that the way I see democracy, there are three main elements that we should focus on. Democracy as a moral dilemma, democracy as a practical challenge, and democracy as an emotional frustration. All these are elements of what you might call the phenomenology, the lived experience of democracy in crisis, with the potential of killing itself, committing suicide. Now, often enough, when we think about democracy as a moral dilemma, comparing it, of course, to other possibilities, right? Because that's what the dilemma and moral choice is all about. We turn to these famous words by Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And it readily, of course, accepts the fact that democracy is not perfect, like any form of government, but it is less flawed, we will say, than other forms of government. We do, however, tend to forget sometimes that alongside this moral reaffirmation of democracy, Churchill also manifested the emotional frustration that comes along with it. The best argument, he said, against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with an average voter. And I guess you might say the same about any democracy, in whatsoever capacity. And I want to give an example of how the moral and the emotional and some practical elements are entwined in the discourse in Israel today. Now, I don't know how many of you read Israeli newspapers, let alone perhaps know how to read them in Hebrew. But to those of you who read Haaretz newspaper, you probably know that the typical way of referring to the governmental plan is a coup. The Hebrew term that is being used is not simply coup, but הפיכה משטרית, which would be oddly translated to English as a sort of a regime coup, right? That's the literal translation. And of course, it's not only Haaretz newspaper. Key thinkers in Israel, such as Yuval Noah Harari, which I imagine some of you know, and political scientists. I'm part of the forum of political scientists against the regime coup. And the key document that the forum has issued in the first line designates what has been going on as a coup, a regime coup. But look, I'm a political scientist, at least by training, of sorts. I've never heard that term before. I've never heard that term before. Regime coup? Doesn't make any sense. If there is a change of a regime, usually we, political scientists, use a completely different term for that. That's revolution. If there is a change of a regime. And if we are talking about a coup, that's coup d'etat, right? The stroke of the state. There is a definition. This is just an example that I'm taking from the Oxford Dictionary of Politics. There is a definition for a coup. It doesn't fit what's going on in Israel. And we still use that. Why? The answer, I argue, is that, well, like it or not, it feels right. Feels right. And that's a troubling conclusion. That's a troubling conclusion. And again, I want to take it to that edge, basically saying, look, even we political scientists, we academics, with all the necessary credentials, in moments like this, often, to some extent, at least put aside some of our academic insights in favor of more, gut reaction? Possibly so. This is not to say that this is necessarily bad or wrong, but it is to observe that it exists. And in order to understand a democratic crisis, you have to understand those aspects of it. It's not just an intellectual engagement, even though the people do carry their, intellectual pedigrees, their sometimes academic degrees around. This is not just about that. It's also moral, it's also emotional. And I will try to entwine the two in the following. Now, much of what you see before you is in Hebrew. I wouldn't go into long translations of those. You do see the sign, right, in English. It's both Hebrew and English. The English reads a proud anarchist. And the reason that many demonstrators against the government plan are carrying signs about that is because they have been accused of being anarchists. Accused of being anarchists. On the upper right side, you see the words by the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, the son of the prime minister. They are not demonstrators, just anarchists. They are terrorists. This is a violent underground movement funded by billionaires of wickeds and criminals. And they will be persecuted for their crimes for those years. A tweet directed to one of the key leaders of the public demonstrators. Realize something, he's telling them. The hope that you are speaking about in such pathos is your hope, not our hope. Our hope is that anarchists, rebels such as yourself, will be put in prison, charged by trying to commit a coup and destroying the Jewish state. This is our hope, the 2,000-year hope. This guy was recently elected to be part of a committee that ran Israeli cinema. So anarchy has been a sort of a discursive coin that people side of the coalition trying to diminish the role and the virtues of the demonstrators against the governmental anarchy. And I thought that that's a good fit. That's a good fit to wonder a bit about democracy and how it resonates in Israel. Because anarchy is really at the cradle of democracy. Anarchy is at the cradle of democracy if you go back to Thomas Hobbes. There is no more, I think, important political treatise than what Thomas Hobbes wrote in the mid-17th century. The book cover of Leviathan. It's remarkable, this frontispiece. And of course, one at least sign of the demonstrator I saw, I really like this photograph, carried Bibi's face as sort of Leviathan. Now, what is interesting about the Leviathan is partly the way that he is both protecting the people, right? That's the cause of the Leviathan, protecting the people, but protected by the people. And look at the Leviathan shield. Look at what it is made of. It's made of people looking up to him to save them. To save them from what? From anarchy. Because that was on Thomas Hobbes' mind throughout. Anarchy. More specifically, the English Civil War of the time, of the mid-17th century. Anarchy is at the heart of an attempt to reach a social contract. And of course, Thomas Rousseau and others, of course, we said, well, in fact, there are other ways to address the possibility, at least, of anarchy, other ways to come together to create a social contract. One of those ways is democracy. Democracy, the rule of the people, or if you will, popular sovereignty. But of course, even that question raises automatically a host of questions. How? Should it be direct or representative? What is the nature of that democracy? And what is the role of majority in democracy? Should it be able to dictate what it wills? And of course, what is the goal of human democracy? I propose, okay, liberation from anarchy, liberation from the potential civil war. Excellent. For what? What is the end goal of democracy? Supposedly, for liberal democracy, it is human sovereignty. To note, because not every democracy is liberal. Not every democracy emphasizes the individual and their liberties. Moreover, I would say, often enough in this crisis as well, and look at the sort of protests that we've seen worldwide, especially in the West, of course, against the governmental plan. Many of those protesters are carried out by Israelis abroad, many of them by Jews abroad, many were accusing the government of being fascist in one way or another. And I'm saying, let's go beyond the slogan. What does it mean, fascism, in this context? Now, first of all, the word itself, fascism, where is it coming from? It comes from fascio, an Italian symbol that was later used or abused by Mussolini in fascist Italy. That's a bunch of roads that are taken together. They are cut to become the same side. And then they are tied together, that they may not escape. And by the sheer might of that, an axe can be installed in the middle in order to provide force. That's fascism. And that's very interesting, right? Visually speaking, fascism is captured by that sign. Unlike, for example, the swastika. Right? If you think about the swastika outside the Nazi context, I mean, why would that even mean what Nazism meant? And we know the origin in the Far East, of course. In the case of fascism, the symbol itself, fascio, clearly declares itself. It makes a lot of sense. What we sometimes overlook, however, is that fascism is not just something that happens outside democracies. It's everywhere in the West, not least in the cradle of democracy, whether it is in France, right, following the French Revolution, or in the US. I imagine that all of you, or at least most of you, have been to DC, to Lincoln Memorial. What is Lincoln sitting on? You know, this massive armchair. What is that massive armchair made of? Fascia. This is the fascia. And when you go to the House of Representatives, to the Congress, when you listen to the speaker, you see the wonderful flag behind him. What is just next to it? The fascia. And this, by the way, was reaffirmed in the US after the rise of fascist Italy. The same symbol, the very same symbol, on both sides of the American flag. And so democracy is always, in one way or another, this is part of the moral dilemma that we always face in democracy. Every single democracy worldwide, between those poles of liberalism and the might of the collective, is very appealing. It's always lurking. The events of January 6th, clearly, in my mind, corresponds with that symbol of fascism. It's part of the might of the masses that sometimes raised and sometimes raised democracies. Now, this is part of the foundation of the moral dilemma that we see in democracy worldwide and specifically in Israel. The practical elements should lead us perhaps to a couple of findings from recent years. So very briefly, I think it's part of almost my duty as a political scientist to present that. Usually we spoke of democracy in late modernity. Wave of democratization. The story, however, is somewhat more complicated than that. In many ways, in recent generation, there has been mostly stagnation when it comes to the advent of democracy worldwide. Moreover, in the past 15 years, and this is from Freedom House, if you look at the number of countries that have improved in terms of their democratic ranking, compared to democracies that have deteriorated, or countries deteriorating, deterioration has been the rule. overall throughout those years. And you can see the data before. Okay, you should bear that in mind. Also, when it comes to a global perspective, whereas we can take some pride and comfort in the right-wing data, right? Over 40% of the number of countries worldwide are free. Democracy and authoritarian regime. If you look at the population, worldwide population, on now, there have been arguments that actually in the past 2-3 years, there have been improvement, at least when it comes to one aspect that is undermining democracy, and that is populism. So I'll just briefly mention that to show you the data. We've seen certain trends like that in Latin America, elsewhere. Still, of course, remains to be seen. Of course, there are disputes. That's important to me. Now, of course, in various democracies worldwide, there are various ways to ensure that as much democracy is kept intact, that as much as liberal elements emphasizing human and civil liberties will be sustained. That is, of course, the case worldwide with liberal democracies, and the list of checks and balances manifests the pluralism, the great diversity that liberal democracies have been turning to in order to ensure that facing liberalism will still be sustained. And you see the list, I imagine that there is no great surprises. Right? In the US, for example, you have many of those elements. You have constitution, you have bicameralism, right? The Congress to the Senate, separate elections to the executive branch, elements of federalism, and various countries worldwide have elements of those checks and balances. We have none of that in Israel. None of that in Israel. Nothing in that list exists in Israel since its establishment. This is no novelty. Election. We had it for 2 brief moments in Israel election. No federalism, regional election, none of that. Right? There is no EU supervising us, like in the case of Hungary and Poland, that many mention as a sort of a comparison to Israel. Israel will not be Hungary or Poland. If Israel annihilate its democracy, it will not turn into Hungary, not just another partly free state. The possibility of full dictatorship, or even worse, a theocracy, is out there. The Supreme Court. As an example of that, there is no real separation of power between the government and the Knesset, between the executive and the legislative. It's effectively the same in the Israeli parliamentary system. Once you establish a and above, if it is strong enough, this is it. The government and the Knesset are basically the one. The Knesset has no real power over the government once the coalition is strong enough. Nothing. And within the government itself, the prime minister holds the power. Effectively, you have a prime minister. And on the other side, you have the Supreme Court. Of course, as you all know, Israel does not have a constitution. Israel has a basic law. In the eyes of the court, above regular laws. Now, overall, the Israeli Supreme Court has not been using that prerogative often. When comparing that to other countries worldwide, Western countries, of course, or democratic countries, in the case of South Africa, for example. the Israeli Supreme Court has been using less its capacity to overturn laws. Still, many people have argued, and perhaps rightly so, that there should be a change, a reform in the judicial system in Israel, a recalibration that will diminish the power of the Supreme Court to overrule decisions and to diversify the committee electing the Supreme Court and the constitution of the Supreme Court itself. Now, these attempts have been going on from quite some time now. I'll just give one example of someone who has been working on that, Gidon Sar. And has been working in various ways in order to promote that. He's from a right-wing party and very right-winger himself. About half, by the way, of the previous coalition could easily be denoted right-wing, in certain aspects even more right-wing than, say, Netanyahu. Sar, up until the time that he stepped away from the Likud, was usually designated as more radical than Netanyahu. Lieberman too, right? Was minister and a close aide to Netanyahu for many years, was considered to be far more radical than Netanyahu, but both of them were denoted as leftists. Trying to make certain changes and have made those changes. In certain aspects, at least, of the conduct of the judicial system. But now it's a different game. It's a completely different ballgame. And of course, we can have a separate discussion entirely devoted to who is behind the plan. The next hour, just to get into those details, but these are some of the key figures and organizations behind it. So of course, the first and foremost is Netanyahu, the prime minister, who has been facing legal allegations for several years now, serious allegations. He's undergoing a trial and wanted to do away with some of the hindrances that are obviously part of it. Aryeh Deri, one of his key partners, a leader of a Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox party, who has been found guilty on various charges on various occasions before, and was thus prevented from becoming again a minister, and wants again to resume that capacity. Several members of Knesset, the key among them are Simcha Rotman and Yariv Levin, who have been championing a radical for emotional and ideological reasons. Both of them are part of the radical right in Israel, and both of them consider the Supreme Court as an enemy of the people of Israel that should be entirely reformed, as it is currently held by leftists, liberals, and other judges who do not come even near to what a truly conservative right-wing judge should look like and rule like. The Kohelet policy forum is very important in the endeavor. It is funded by American billionaires, have been working diligently to fund various organizations and to help key members of the current coalition in order to make the changes. And of course, there are various media outlets. The key among them is Channel 14, that has become almost like a private media network of Netanyahu and those who support him. Some of the key proposals for changes now includes the following. changes to the Judicial Selection Committee, so it will be completely controlled by the coalition, that whatever the coalition decides will happen, that it will basically have the right to nominate whomever they seek to nominate to the Supreme Court. There have been some suggestions to somewhat slightly moderate. If you read the fine print, it amounts to the same. Right? We will nominate now 2 Supreme Court judges, and the head of the Supreme Court will be by the coalition, and thus he or she will be able to later conduct their affairs according to our will. No less important, in my mind, perhaps even more, basic laws cannot be repealed. A key aspect to all of this supposed reform, okay? In my mind, the key question that anyone should ask themselves about the current proposal by the government is as follows. Suppose that this reform passes. What on earth will the coalition be unable to do? And the answer to that question is one. None. Nothing. There is nothing that the coalition will not be able to do if this reform passes. And so, for example, going back to basic laws cannot be repealed. The current coalition, in say 61 majority, a monarchy, like what Hobbes suggested to us. Or more practically, perhaps, in one way or another, prevent our parties or our members of Knesset to run for election. And this is not some delusionary scenarios. These laws have been put on the table by members of the coalition. Or perhaps defer the election to another 10 years from now. This is taken almost word by proposals currently being made by members of Knesset from the coalition. So that's about basic laws, and it will make repelling regular laws extremely hard. Unreasonableness, which is one of the clauses that allows the Supreme Court to address certain appeals about governmental decisions, will be abolished. The role of the legal advisors will become political appointees that will basically have no say. So this is what the coalition would like to see happening. I've provided in the next couple of slides the public opinion polls in what's going on in Israel. Overall, I wouldn't get into the subtleties of the numbers. Later on, we can discuss those, but what I might be able to say is that overall, even before the reform, even before that proposal, Israeli public has increasingly saw substantial dangers to democracy in Israel, and at the same time, right-wingers who thought that there is danger to democracy want to have a strong leader to take care of business. Seems like it's a contradiction, but in their mind, it seems like a cause and effect. Danger to democracy, so we should have a strong leader to take care of things. What is the danger to democracy? Then the will of the people is not fulfilled. Who is the people? And we're treated as second-class citizens. That's important. And I'm trying to say it in a non-judgmental way, because I'm in some ways part of that. I mean, my family, part of it, right-wingers all the way through. And they do see themselves as being treated as second-class citizens. My mother will be the first saying that this is the way that she has been treated, that our family has been treated, that I personally have been treated. She would say it to me. Okay, so this is the sentiment. been deprived of our rights, we should have a strong leader like Netanyahu who can take care of us. And still, if you look at public opinion polls in terms of the public trust, one of the key arguments of the current coalition is that there is no trust, public trust, in the Israeli Supreme Court. It is true that the trust has been deteriorated, but it is also true that public trust in the Supreme Court is far higher than that put in the government, the media, the Knesset, or political parties. And it has been deteriorating mostly in the years of under Netanyahu, especially after he was put to trial. And I would like to use the remaining minutes that we have before we'll open for discussion of the emotional underpinning of the current crisis. And to say that, yes, to my mind, democracy in many ways is frustration. This is what democracy, to a large extent, is all about. Democracy is an invitation to listen to others with whom you strongly disagree. And this is hard. This is very, very hard. And it's even more difficult when those are voices not just without, but within as well. That you begin to doubt yourself. You know, when people speak about democracy, sometimes they speak about agora, right? Going back to Athenian democracy. Agora, the marketplace of ideas. I would like to emphasize agoraphobia. Not in the usual sense of the anxiety about closed or open spaces when you have no exit, but in terms of the metaphor implied in agoraphobia. For many, triggers agoraphobia. Because it's a scary place, it's a scary space to inhabit. A space in which you feel threatened by others because they think differently, because they feel differently, because they look different, because they behave differently. This is hard. Now, at those moments, it becomes even more appealing to try and escape your freedom, what I mentioned before. To escape choices. And perhaps some of you have read this book. I think it's remarkable. An oldie, but still remarkable. Eric Fromm, Escape from Freedom. I mentioned that so many of us try to escape from freedom by turning into control, either being controlled by others or controlling others. Sort of sadistic, masochistic interplay. Because it's very hard. Mannheim said to embrace democracy, because look, in his mind, what the personality, the democratic personality is like. It's not about compromise, he emphasized, right? There's something very instrumental about compromise. He wrote the important element in this conception of democratic personality and behavior is that the person who acts in its spirit is not only unwilling to superimpose his own views and will upon other fellow, the essence of a domineering attitude, but he's tolerant by absorbing some features of a human being essentially different from himself. Practically, this means that the democratic personality welcomes disagreement because it has the courage to expose itself to change. So unbelievably difficult. This is so unbelievably hard, and it's hard for everyone to different extent, but it's hard for everyone to expose yourself like that, to admit the vulnerability, the fallibility. And there are public opinion polls about different societies, their willingness to tolerate uncertainty. Israeli society is good in many things, but tolerating uncertainty is not one of the main things that we may proud ourselves. And perhaps that makes a lot of sense. Being so vulnerable collectively, or at least feeling that we are vulnerable collectively, and wishing for certainty. Right? In my other studies, you mentioned my book about the mortality and morality of nations. A lot of that dealt with existential uncertainty. You wish to have those anchors that you can hold fast onto and say, well, I have that. You want to avoid uncertainty. You want, in a sense, to find home. Something that, is part of the human condition, sort of ongoing longing that all of us experience in one way or another. And I thought that juxtaposing these two signs would be illuminative. I will translate. What we have on the left is a demonstration slogan. And this is the home of all of us. The sort of translation that I would make. But on the right hand, it's the remarkably successful election slogan campaign of Ben Gvir. And the slogan reads, again, it will be hard to translate it in the Hebrew vibe, but it's sort of, who here are the homeowners? Question mark. With the clear implications that we have lost our home to the others, especially to the Arabs, who are endangering our security. And we need someone like Ben Gvir, who would show everyone who is the real homeowners. And this is our home. It's the home of the Jewish people and no one else. By extension, perhaps, of certain segments of the Jewish people more than others, who are all too willing to leave their home, if anything, who are threatening to immigrate. And we don't have much time, so I wouldn't dwell on that so much, only just to show that many people in Israel are willing to go radical. Look at the bottom right. Perhaps it would be best to dismantle all the country's political institutions and start over from scratch. That's almost half. Dismantle everything and start from scratch. Now, I've been in the US for enough time to know that Israel is not that exceptional. The sort of public resentment that comes from various sources, the feeling of being a second-class citizen, the way that the instigations from above tap into them. What's going on now with the Trump's trial might be an exact, well, not exact, but an echo of what we have. This, I think, is remarkable, just to indicate the way that those who support the think and feel about what they are doing. So this is what he said in a recent interview. And he's one of the key instigators of the plan. He has been dreaming about it for decades. I'm King Solomon. I should explain that you must not leave that infant in the hands of those who are willing to burn the country because they lost the election. They, meaning those demonstrators, the people who oppose the governmental plan, they demonstrate that they are unworthy to hold it. Now, the baby, of course, is the country, Israel. Our job is to tell these people, guys, you're not the real mother. So, leave aside the hubris behind Rothman designating himself as King Solomon. And perhaps on that regard, it's not incidental that the name of the forum that I mentioned before is Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. More to the point, the people who disagree with him are not the real mother. There is no shared custody over the land or the country or the state or its institutions. They are not the real mother. They are a bunch of liars. And many of the supporters of the coalition do treat the demonstrator exactly as such. Many of them do not believe that they really do care about what's been going on now, that they hurt, that they're afraid. And of course, Rothman doesn't conclude what he might have concluded from the judgment of Solomon, right? In the biblical narrative, the real mother actually suggested to give the infant to the other mother, thereby showing that she is the real mother. I do not see Rothman or any others giving the country, so to speak, to those who oppose them, just to indicate that they love the country so much. Maybe we'll conclude with that. Maybe we'll conclude with that. So we'll have about half an hour or so, right, Shoshana, if I'm not mistaken? Yeah, to Q&A. I have a couple of other slides that perhaps the Q&A will, invite me to bring about, but that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we have questions and comments. If you want to use the raise hand icon at the bottom, or if you can probably keep it under a little bit organized that way. So anybody have anything they'd like to ask or say?
One thing that I will say, please do not be shy at all about it, okay? I mean, I've been for enough years in the US to learn the difference between Israeli students who would speak out loud without even thinking for a moment, just because,
Yeah.
they're in the good vibe for that, to American students who are sometimes so shy and reluctant to speak their mind that it's heartbreaking. Be like Israelis now. Just say what you think, okay?
Channel your inner Israelis. Come on.
Exactly. Put it
We know
out
they're
there.
in there. Well, I'm going to start by just pointing out that the similarities between what you're talking about in Israel, and you did touch on it a little bit about what's happened here in the US. And for those of us who grew up thinking that democracy was an unalterable, fact of.
Shoshana,
Yes.
can you please repeat? I didn't hear the last couple of seconds.
So in America, I grew up thinking that democracy was an unalterable, forever kind of thing. And I'm now, of course, in my old age, seeing that actually is not true. And if you read history, obviously it's not true. But this business of particularly, I think the problems with our election in 2020, whenever that was, and the problems in Israel now, where you have someone who is basically a criminal asserting himself and getting a coalition of like-minded people to basically undo the tenets of the country, or the things that we thought the country was founded on. And how does one react to that?
Well, first, a correction, right? Netanyahu has not been yet, at least.
He's accused. I'm sorry.
He is accused. So right now, I would stay away from saying that he's a criminal. And it is very true that what we have been experiencing in certain, at least, democratic countries in recent years, is sort of a awakening call. It's not the force of nature, democracy, that is.
Mm.
It's a human creation. Like, we created it. And the way that we created democracy, we can also deconstruct it and maybe even destroy it in time. It's up to people whether to build democracy, to retain democracy, or to annihilate democracy. To your question, how we react to that. You've read the news over the past, now it's 3 months, over 3 months, actually. And it has been growing in many public spheres. I remember the first demonstrations that I was participating at, it was in front of the Knesset at the day the government was sworn in. before that legislation was put on the table. That wasn't part of the plan, by the way. That reform was not part of the key 4 points that Netanyahu made explicit in the day that the government sworn in. He mentioned the cost of living, taking care of the Iranian nuclear threat, things like that. Nothing about the judicial reform. But at that demonstration in front of the Knesset, there were about 1,000, 2,000 people. Now it is a countrywide movement of demonstrations on a weekly basis. Sometimes when it's not easy. Yesterday, for example, it wasn't easy, and we, we had our dilemma, apropos a moral dilemma, we had our dilemma yesterday. Because if you read the news, you know that there has been yet another violent escalation. And it's not always, it's never clear what is the best thing to do under those circumstances. So do you go and demonstrate, even though there are dangers to your country, to your people? And again, I live in Jerusalem, which is a hub of so much of that violence. Ultimately, across the country, to express our determination to keep democracy. Now, this is part of it. Being there, demonstrating, proclaiming our will. Another part, of course, is extending our hands to those who disagree with the political perspectives of this. And at least in the demonstration in Jerusalem, and for me, it's heartwarming to see that there are so many people who are not part of the usual suspects, so to speak. Right? There are more religious people participating in the demonstration in Jerusalem than you would typically see. It's not just left wings, liberals, etc., but all those who see themselves committed to democracy, basically. And these are, of course, important elements in the effort, though overall, I should say, of course, the current coalition has 64 supporters. And it seems to be quite robust, even very robust. 5 of them, or 4 at least, to, in the name of democracy, leave the comfort of the government and the ruling coalition. So far, it hasn't been. So we should be realistic about what we are facing and hold on to hope that we might still be able to end the collapse, the suicide of Israel's democracy.
Thank you. Stephen?
Thank you. Recently, Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir have rebuked American leaders, Biden in particular, and the American ambassador to Israel for, in effect, meddling in Israel's internal affairs. Ben-Gvir said, "What do you think? You're the 51st star in the we're the 51st star in the American." So essentially, they said, "Mind your own business."
Yes.
But I'm curious about American Jews. Americans who are Jewish. I assume most of the participants in this discussion. Should we also mind our own business? What would you? You're obviously sitting in Jerusalem. We're sitting in New Haven and the surrounding areas. What's our responsibility? Or, in fact, we're being told this is a democratically elected government of Israel that Netanyahu claims reflects the will of the people. Who are we to contravene the will of the Israeli people? That's the argument that I think was made quite explicit. The fact that American Jews are I think for the most part, don't buy that, but are unsure. What is their role? So what would you advise?
So there are 2 aspects to that. One, let's go just for the facts, right? Let's try to analyze the facts and the arguments that are being made. And then we can discuss what sort of moral take we want to embrace it. So regarding the facts, yes, the government is democratically elected. No question about it. The elections were completely democratic. The current coalition won fair and square. Absolutely. What we should also note is that the current coalition was not supported during the election by a plurality of voters. The current coalition is ruled by 48.6 or the platforms of the parties. You could arguably say that more people voted for the opposition than for the coalition. And certainly not more than 50%. Transpired so that the coalition has 64 seats. It's mainly due to the threshold law in Israel. Two relatively small parties that are very much part of the opposition came very, very, very close to the threshold. If it did pass, there would be no majority to the coalition. Moreover, if you look at public opinion polls, the plurality of those who support the coalition did not envision this reform, do not support this reform, and urge their leader to come to accommodation. If you look at it nationwide in public opinion polls, the majority reject the current plan of the government. And this has been consistent across public opinion polls throughout. Moreover, the proposal to hold the plebiscite, which I explicitly made in one of my articles in Haaretz, I explicitly made that proposal to have a referendum. Let's have a plebiscite. Why tearing the country apart? You're so convinced that the people support this reform, just put it to plebiscite. That was declined, which was to be expected. Right? When I wrote it, I explicitly said that in all likelihood this is going to be rejected, and it was. And now to what American Jews might want to do about it. I've been following the news in Israel and in the US and elsewhere. And allow me to be Israeli blunt about enough. I don't think that you're doing hardly enough. Participating in Zoom conversations such as the one that we're holding now, that's very cool. And I appreciate that remarkably. That's not enough. This is the most important moment in Israel's history after its foundation in 48. This is, I believe, a time for full mobilization of whatsoever resources and means you can muster in order to fight for what you think is right to fight for Israel's democracy. This is what you should be doing. And I haven't seen much of that being done. I've seen more in the past couple of weeks than in the first 2 months, but it's hardly enough. So much of the inspiration of what's going on in Israel is coming from the US. Inspiration, and I should say intellectual backing, and specifically funding. Words were used almost word by word in the proposed legislation. It is funded by American billionaires, American Jews. I know that many American Jews or left-leaning, just people who care about democracy, abhor what the government is now doing. And it's not just Let's put it on the table. And it's not just the judicial overhaul. It's far more than that. The judicial overhaul is just to open the door for many other things that they would like to see going on. I know that many American Jews abhor that. I think they could do much more. I don't know, for example, why so many American Jewish celebrities are not out there voicing their opinion. Where are they? Key individuals in various institutions.
That's
I
a
don't
very,
know.
that would be a very long discussion about anti-Semitism of oneself. I mean, I can't really think of any American celebrities who are going to put themselves on that line, but that's a whole different talk.
I mentioned before in the almost opening slide about Jean-Paul Sartre and the notion of choice and freedom.
Mhm.
Okay, it's freedom versus fear at this moment.
Yes,
You want to yield to fear, but let's make it clear that this is a choice too. And I understand the stakes, and the stakes are high everywhere. I do understand the stakes. But let's be honest about it. This is a moment of choice. This is where we define ourselves, what we believe in, what we are willing potentially to sacrifice. Right? And as I mentioned, these dilemmas are everywhere.
yes.
Whether it is, what I mentioned about last night, going or not going, or, a couple of days before that, whether we are bringing our kids with us to a demonstration or not, because there have been eruptions of violence. So should this going on everywhere around here?
I want to give the Weitzmans
Yeah,
a
of course,
chance
of course.
because they've had their hand up for a while. I don't know which one of you had something to say, but
I'll start, but maybe Mark will chime in. So come lean forward so you can chime in. So first of all, thank you so much. This has been really incredibly thought-provoking, a bit depressing, but really very, very interesting. So it seemed like, Bibi was a bit surprised by the strength of the protests, the tenacity, the ongoing nature, and it resulted in this kind of pause, the pause for Pesach. And it also seems like he sort of backed into a corner a bit. And it seems like there's a bit of a history that Netanyahu has used things like war and attacks in the past to kind of rally people and sort of, rally people around him and shut down things like dissent. And I guess my question is, do you think that's what's happening?
I can't hear you now. Now I lost the last couple of seconds.
The last thing was about, I don't know where I lost you, but that it seems like
Running around the flag was the last one.
it's say sorry, I don't know exactly. Where did you lose it?
Netanyahu rallying around the flag is the last.
Not the flag, using war and using attacks
Right.
and rocket incursions and kind of provocative behaviors, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and all of this to kind of shut down his attacks, rally people. Do you think that's what's happening now with these attacks? And what do you think the strategy is going to be? Because he does seem backed into a corner. So curious what you think is happening now, and if that's something that you could see happening, as his go-to strategy.
I think that once you appoint to your government to such key roles, people such as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, this is what you have in store. You will see violence one way or another, and this is really just the beginning. Now, I would not suggest necessarily that Netanyahu orchestrated that. I would actually be surprised if he orchestrated part of it. But I can easily see him welcoming escalation, just according to what we political scientists might denote as diversion theory, right? Which is variation on rally around the flag of the nation, right? Against enemies, real or imagined. And again, let's be frank about it. Israel does have real enemies, and quite a few of those, which makes the current situation even more perilous, more risky. And Netanyahu's decision, for example, to fire his Minister of Security, but then to somehow resolve without. And the fact that so many of recent decisions by Netanyahu has been influenced by his son, whose words I briefly quoted before, and apparently by his wife as well. It's a reason for concern, but overwhelmingly, this is Netanyahu's responsibility. And yes, I think he was surprised by the extent of the demonstration. I think that if he had to calculate it now, having learned what he learned in recent months, he would probably try to do the same thing. The same thing, because I believe that Netanyahu aims for Leviathan. Netanyahu wants a dictatorship. But he would have done it, I think, in a much more gradual way. In that regard, we might be thankful for Netanyahu for this myopia of not seeing the potential of making such radical decisions so immediately, so completely, because it woke up the people. If it would have been more gradual, pretty much okay. Not as much as we would hope for, but okay. And in 4 years from now, we would have faced a dictatorship. But they put all the cards, or at least many of the cards, on the table. And that's valuable.
Ruth?
Hi, everyone, and hi, Uriel. Thanks so much for this illuminating talk. I guess on the question of how, let's start from the assumption that this is like 1948. This is a huge moment, which I think is not evident to American Jews largely. I guess my question is, how do we talk to American Jews on the left? Because from America, it seems like this incredibly powerful movement has arisen, and what it is asking for is a return to a status quo that already seemed really problematic to most of the Jews I know on the left. And so I know a lot of people who do not seem especially compelled to speak up for this, because it seems like we're holding the line for a democracy that was already partial for many of the inhabitants in that area. And so I'm curious how you think about that and how you recommend talking about it.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that sentiment. I know that many people share it. And look, for people who have been opposing Israel's policies for quite some time now, sometimes decades, it's very hard now to become part of an effort that, as you say, seemed to basically reaffirm the status quo. And I can tell you, for example, I think that you wouldn't mind that my wife shared with me her reluctance of waving the flag, because there was something about it that seemed unfair. Israel has not been treating fairly, for example, its own Arab citizens. And certainly if we go to discuss we haven't addressed it the way that we should have addressed it. And so I understand that sentiment. And I think it boils down to something that, in my mind at least, is captured by the name of the national anthem of Israel. That is hope. I spoke about democracy as frustration. That's one side of the emotional coin. The brighter side of the emotional coin is hope. Because what democracy provides us with is the hope to change things for the better, non-violently. Giving up democracy is giving up hope. is basically saying something along the lines of, look, Israel disappointed me. It is not, so to speak, the promised land that we hoped for. And now with that disappointment, perhaps it's better that just to do away with it. And maybe in that regard, American Jews who hold to that opinion are not that much different from what I noticed before in the public opinion poll regarding Israelis who are saying, let's do away with everything, just build it anew. And I understand the sentiment. When things look bad, sometimes you just want to destroy everything and build it anew. What I would encourage you to do at those moments is just consider, after taking some deep breath, what are the implications of that? Because that destruction is a huge destruction of not just material aspects, but of human life, of dreams. And who knows when and if we will be able to reignite anything similar to something that many American Jews too thought of as a true miracle, the rebirth of a Jewish state, and the remarkable achievements that I think all of us, both Israelis, Jews and Arabs, and American Jews, and Jews worldwide, can still take much pride of. Because those achievements are there. They are part of this remarkable creation. And there are exceptional things, I believe, in Israel and its existence that can provide so much, not only for Israelis, but worldwide. The question for us is if we want to give that up. Because basically now, doing nothing or very little is giving up Israel. Saying, well, okay.
Can be on a while.
They screwed up. They should just,
That's nice.
pay the price and let's see what happens. I wouldn't, and I don't. But that's really a choice for each and every one of us individually to be made. For me, it's almost like giving up on in some ways, on your child that has done something wrong, terribly wrong. What is the point when you're saying it's not redeemable any longer? And for me, the line passes where you can still see a tremendous effort to make things right. And I think that to everyone who is looking at Israeli society, you can see that there are a lot of people who are trying to make things right. And the question to American Jews, do you want to support it and support your dreams, what you hoped for? Or do you prefer to give that up? And that's for really each and every one of us to decide, both individually and together. And I know the time is up, but if you would like to stay and have more questions, I'm here for you. It's entirely up to you.
Well, one thing occurs to me, and I'm afraid it would be a very long answer, but as you're talking, I'm thinking we have, because like we were talking about the American left and how it's been hard for them to support Israel, and there's all these things. What if this is the moment when some of those dreams about really creating a fair and equal democratic state for all who live in Israel? What if this is our chance? I mean, is that a possibility that we could bring people together who have been marginalized while some people are still bombing them and trying to get them to leave? Is that a possible way to bring a new generation, a new growth?
I think the possibility exists. I want to be realistic about it because we know the challenges, we know the difficult odds. But let me tell you just about my experience in the demonstration in Jerusalem yesterday, last night. Okay. So I'm just thinking now about the list of speakers that we had. So we had a teenager from a high school, actually my son's high school. And she was speaking so wonderfully about her commitment, and she's the 10th grade, I think she's 16-year-old, like my son. And it was remarkable to listen to her. And this is the next generation that we want to work for. And there was a rabbi speaking about the importance of democracy. And a woman, ultra Orthodox, who mentioned that this is an opportunity to say that, yes, we want the ultra Orthodox to be part of the effort, but we want the women too to be part of that effort. And it's not right that the president does not include that group in the discussions being held now. And there was a woman Arab leader from Acre, right, up in the north, who spoke wonderfully, I think, about seeing this as a possibility for Jews and Arabs coming together to not just sustain, but to rebuild our democracy in a way that will indeed be better. Now, when I'm looking at those people in Jerusalem, you know, with all the tensions and sometimes violence and often animosity, and it is, you know, it is troubled life. Living in Jerusalem, I can tell you, you know, firsthand, it's not easy. But it's not in those places where it is so hard to come together, that if we here manage to do it, just imagine the implications, not just for Israel. Imagine the implications worldwide. If we can make it here, we can make it anywhere. You know, Frank Sinatra, like, it's a possibility. And again, the question is whether or not we want to support that hope. If we want to help people hope, this, I think, is the task of our generation, whatever this your age is. This is our generation. I think this is our task. This is our moment to make that effort.
Great. I just want to note that Debbie Elkin wrote in the chat about grassroots perspectives from the pro-democracy uprising in Israel this morning. It's starting at 11:30. So if you want details, look at the chat. And also along those lines, Iris, do you want to say anything, or do you want us to just look at the piece that you put in the chat? Is she also, I guess it's the same thing. No, that was a different one.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we're a group of Israelis in Yale and affiliated, and everybody is welcome to join our protests every Sunday at 3 p.m. Sunny outside.
Where is it?
Come and join us and bring your own sign, or just come to support us. Thank you.
Where is it held?
The Sterling Library.
Okay.
I put a link. I don't remember the address.
Okay, the Sterling Library, we can find it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think we could go on talking all day, but I'm sure everybody, including Professor Abulof, has other things to do this afternoon, but thank you so very much. Pesach, we got to be, I have my family here, which I have my last few moments with them.
That's the deal.
But thank you, everyone who participated. And obviously, this is a very important issue for all of us. And I'm sure the conversation will continue, and we may need to invite you back again. I don't know. And next time you're in the States, please let us know so that we can maybe do something in person.
Will do.
Thank you.